much. Our next speaker is Derek Angus, who's going to try and link all of this together with some difficulty, I'm sure, to talk about electronic health records as examples of big data for smarter generation of signals. Derek.
Thank you very much, Alistair. So, yes, the pre-call was a little intimidating with Martin when I was laying out what I might talk about, and he was quite quick to point out that it didn't sound incendiary enough or controversial enough. And so I thought, okay, my slides are far too academic, so I'll probably put in things here that are going to be quite offensive. I might be on the wrong side of incendiary. So I'm going to talk a little bit about moving into the post-approval space and some of the challenges in thinking about conducting RCTs in this burgeoning world of big data from electronic health records. So in terms of thinking about the post-approval world, this of course can be characterized as a data-poor, opinion-rich environment. And that at the time that a therapy arrives with approval, the RCT evidence that led to that approval is both too broad in that the overall treatment effect is considered average and not personalized. It doesn't generate individual personal estimates, which not only make anyone from basic science interested in precision medicine upset, but equally the bedside clinician feels like they know perfectly well that the trial just doesn't make sense for the patient in front of them. Similarly, as well as being too broad, it's a Goldilocks problem because it's also too narrow in that the trial population is not considered representative of general practice and it doesn't address the broader effect from this issue. At the same time, usually it's not really a broad comparative effectiveness. It's usually being compared against only one standard, and there may in fact be several alternatives. Nonetheless, that doesn't stop lots of people wanting access to the drug. Some want more information before they use it, but no one particularly wants to be a guinea pig, and so it makes it very difficult, and there's no overall control on how to generate systematically the appropriate information that we need post-approval. Now we have the era of big data, where if you turn on the TV during an NFL game, you'll be told by IBM that Big Blue is going to solve all our problems, and one of them is the BioView experiment from Vanderbilt, where they'll talk about with the integration of deep personalized data by combining EHR data with discarded blood into biobanks, you can make causal inferences on optimal care that is both broad in that it describes the entire practice in a real-world setting, and narrow in that it will generate personal estimates for individuals, and comparative in that it will compare all options. At the same time, as nicely pointed out from a paper last year in Health Affairs, this whole thing can happen fast enough that it can be promoted live to the patient and the clinician so that it can be used to guide decisions based on the existing evidence. And so if we were to have a little report card for different evidence generators, we would say that, and I'm using the term big data analytics as the sort of the colloquial lay term for all things relating to machine learning, observational cohort studies, and so forth. You could say that, first of all, it's really great because it leverages the electronic health record, and therefore, once you've paid for the electronic health record, any additional information should come at a relatively low incremental cost. It provides estimates of real-world effectiveness. It considers multiple therapies. It provides personalized estimates, and it could even offer those options live. The only problem is this issue of whether it actually generates robust estimates of causal inference. And so for causal inference, if it's possible to randomize, couldn't we still be randomizing? And so then the trialists say, well, we can raise our hand. We are doing something about clinical trials in the EHR space. We have this emerging world of what are called point-of-care clinical trials, which try to find a clinical moment in the electronic health record that alerts the clinical trial machinery and allows a live generation of enrollment into a trial. And so this is a cartoon from the first example described 4 years ago from the Palo Alto VA group, showing that when you place an insulin order, that would be a moment to point out that there's some uncertainty about inpatient management of diabetes, and it could prompt the physician and the patient to consider enrollment in a trial. Where has this gone today? It's rolled into what are essentially, I would call, the large pragmatic trial arenas. So the same group is now launching this fall a huge 13,000 VA trial of hypertensive veterans testing one thiazide against another. Another trial funded by Picori, I don't know if it started enrolling yet, went to the DCRI. It's called adaptable, but there's nothing adaptable in the design. It's 2 aspirin doses, a low dose and a high dose, in 20,000 cardiovascular disease patients. Both trials are meant to leverage getting triggered inside the EHR. So if we go back to our report card, this looks great because it's addressing causal inference, it's leveraging the EHR, should be low cost, and should speak to real-world effectiveness. The problem is not really considering multiple therapies, and it's not generating personalized estimates or live tailored options. So is there another class of trial? Well, there's the so-called platform trials, as described by Scott Berry earlier this year. This is a class of adaptive trials that focus on the disease and not just a particular therapy, can test multiple interventions over time with essentially perpetual enrollment that might be governed by what the FDA would call a master protocol. And importantly, built into this trial design, there's a tailoring of choices over time using response adaptive randomization and potentially using biomarkers to stop enrollment into subsets of patients that are performing poorly. These trials have largely focused on the pre-approval space with emphasis on efficiency and often very small sample sizes, with the outcome being, for example, having a therapy graduate to the next phase from phase 2 to being a candidate for phase 3. And the poster child is the iSpy2 platform for rapid phase 2 screening and discovery in breast cancer, led by the clinical PIs, Laura Isserman, who was mentioned earlier. So just a word about responsive adaptive randomization for those that don't live in clinical trial land. If you throw up a normal trial design, obviously a patient in a parallel group design is exposed to 2 therapies, A or B. We have a randomization rule. As patients go through the trial, data is accumulated. That data can populate a statistical model, which can be used as essentially an algorithm based on the accruing memory in the trial about what's happened with the patients thus far, to then change the allocation rules, still random, but change the weighting for subsequent patients. So that, for example, later in the trial, the odds can be weighted towards the best treatment, new arms can be activated or dropped, and even there can be different weights for different patient groups based on putative biomarkers. So if we go back to our evidence generator, this looks great in that now we can consider multiple therapies, personalized estimates, and so forth. The problem is they're small, they're outside real world, they don't leverage the EHR. So the question is, can we put these things together and have something that really sort of solves all of these issues? And this gets to essentially a novel blend of point of care trials plus platform designs put together, which could be called, we're calling Remap, randomized embedded multifactorial adaptive platform trials. And the only example I know of thus far, though there are others sort of described theoretically, is the Remap severe pneumonia trial that's been funded by the European Union under an FP7 grant of about 25 million euros, and it looks like it's probably going to also be funded to launch in Australia and New Zealand under an Australian NHMRC grant. That's going to enroll as a starter over 6,000 patients admitted to the ICU with severe pneumonia and simultaneously test different antimicrobial strategies, different host immunomodulation, and different ventilation with built-in responsive adaptive randomization and stopping rules for multiple potential subgroups. So it's obviously embedded in that it's triggered by a clinical moment. These design features are multifactorial in that they think about domains of interventions and domains of subgroups. And they're adaptive in that they try to change the odds for success during the trial. And so in a way, it's a little bit like the green button promised by big data in that patients are being preferentially assigned over time to the best performing arm. The allocation is random, but not necessarily 50-50. And so you're not necessarily a guinea pig, though it's important to recognize that the green button is being pressed in a relatively parentalistic way. It's being pressed by the trial. The trial has the participant's interests at heart, but isn't giving the participant the choice. So Remap severe pneumonia looks a little bit like this, just as a working example. In terms of the clinical moment for embedding, it's the ICU admission set, the ICU order set that triggers going back to the clinical trial machinery. And this is approved already in the Netherlands, where the trial will launch with delayed consent. So it all happens automatically. I use the phrase delayed consent because that's what they call it. I know we would argue there's no such thing. And then in terms of the design, just to give you a sense of the complexity, these different domains like pathogen management, host immunomodulation, and ventilation are 3 separate domains. They're testing separate factors in each. And so you end up having 12 separate regimens all being undergoing response adaptive randomization that's tailored to 4 separate subgroups, so that you're essentially accruing and generating 48 separate estimates of treatment effect, although they're estimated from an overarching model as described below that also includes a factor to account for time, because obviously there can be non-proportional exposure to the different arms over time. Okay, but I was asked to be aspirational, so I've thrown out something that looks really exciting, but something that's really exciting and sort of in the future doesn't come without problems. And there's a long list of them. Obviously, the data, the quality and integration of the EHR within large systems or across consortia, the issue of getting people to agree to a standardized point of care clinical moment so that there's a standard order set that can go to the machinery, and then the machinery can then spit back the bits that have been flipped on the order set. Institutional commitment is huge in terms of, and I mean the healthcare provider, in terms of leadership, financial support, and incentives. The ethics can't be trivialized, although some of this could be framed as largely falling in the comparative effectiveness debate when controlling interventions that are already broadly available. I'm not trivializing it, I'm just saying it's relatively similar to the same debate. And then there's definitely issues about statistics and design. Most of those circulate around power and alpha error. The particular model that I described is built as a Bayesian model, and so all of the estimates of power, et cetera, are generated through simulation. Zilong Lei from Stanford Biostats has just recently written a paper trying to offer some closed forms frequentist solutions for a similar design. So just as we heard from the last speaker, it's not necessarily the case that this can only be tackled in a Bayesian approach. There are other things, reporting and dissemination. We still don't have rules for graduating winners and losers. You could reach a definitive point to stop exposing a particular subgroup to a particular intervention while the trial is running. How do you write that up? What's the rules for stopping? How do you declare? And do you write it up if it's Bayesian with Bayesian probability, or do you, after the fact, try to generate p-values? And unfortunately, the only example in the literature so far did just that. The whole trial ran Bayesian, and then somewhere something ugly must have happened between the authors and the reviewers, because the published paper still looks like it was some sort of after-the-fact frequentist design. Funding, who pays for interventions, who funds the overall trial design, what should be studied and in what order. Some of this was generated out of meetings by the HEROES Consortium to try to have an international approach towards pandemic response, and it turned out that the more people there were in the room, the more opinions there were about what interventions should be studied first. The good thing about this approach is you can study multiple, but there's still many things that don't get on the list, and there's no real plan. And so when we spoke to Don Berry about iSpy2, and we said, what quantitative way do oncologists make a ranking of all the things to push into iSpy2, he said, oh, oncologists just get in a room and then they come and they tell us the list. And I don't know whether that's an explicit VOI or not. It probably isn't. And then what's the oversight? Who should be in charge? And what's integration with other clinical research programs? So in conclusion, the post-approval space is a mess. Conflating the EHR with big data analytics could make things worse, especially if we let the allure of big data thwart efforts to randomize. But there are huge barriers to randomizing the post-approval space. That trials often fail to answer questions adequately broad and narrow, and no one wants to be a guinea pig. The EHR could provide an opportunity for novel design that merges point of care with platform that can mimic best choice for a patient, which actually puts the patient safer to be in the trial than out of it, and could even be framed, if broad scale, in a healthcare system as a continuous quality improvement engine, but not an inconsiderable set of challenges. Thanks.